So thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak on the panel from QED and sit alongside a very esteemed panel. You will also have to forgive me as well, because I'm going to come at this from the very strategic and business and practical perspective, and probably mention legislation very little. So I'll mention customers and clients and citizens a lot, and there's a method in that, because obviously what we deal with all day long, and you know, to Nick's point, is we deal with the practical, we deal with how that's implemented and the outcomes and how that affects our clients and consumers more generally. But I thought, just by way of intro, I might explain who Legal & General are and what we currently do in the EU as a starter for 10. So for those who are not aware, Legal & General has long been providing financial services and insurance services to our clients for over 180 years. We are a UK-based company, but we operate on a worldwide basis. We have about 10 million customers worldwide, and we are one of the world's largest asset management arms, which is the part of the division that I look after, and from a European perspective. So we have recently reached the milestone of being over 1 trillion AUM, which is quite a celebration for us. We're the 11th largest asset manager in the world. We're striving to be in the top 10, I might add. But just more importantly, from an EU perspective, we have just shy of 50 billion AUM for EU 27 clients. And I think that's an important number when we're talking about how cross-border regulation affects our EU clients, because that's across all the different blue dots you'll see on the map behind us. And not only that, we've got a range of regulated funds that are domiciled here, which have European investors, but also have investors outside the EU 27 as well, on a global basis, which is one of the benefits UCITS that we'll come on and talk about later on. So you know, those funds are registered across the EU, as well as being sold elsewhere as well. So I think that's a really important point when we're talking about cross-border, particularly here. So we're just to kind of go through some of the jargon on the right-hand side of my slide, we provide our clients with kind of a leading investment solutions, as we call it. And you know, to the points that have been raised here, the importance in being able to do that is access to markets globally and to have lots of tools in your toolkit. So our lovely little acronyms: AFI, active fixed income; LDI, liability-driven investment; index, passive investing; and FBI is factor-based; multi-asset, real assets, to the point earlier, and most importantly ESG, which we see as a growing trend. You know, these are all things that we bring together to offer kind of long-term solutions for our clients, who are fundamentally looking for long-term returns, because they are pension schemes and they are wholesale relationships that we have, who are looking to help our clients kind of meet their investment goals. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about these regulations, because ultimately the regulations are there to allow people to have access to these investment solutions, and that's an important part, right? And we're very passionate, as you might imagine, in making sure that we're part of that kind of social policy reform. We're involved in sustainability initiatives. We're leading the charge in ESG, and there's plenty of aspects like that we think about as a business. So that's a little whistle-stop tour of L&G in the European Union. I mentioned I was going to talk about customers quite a lot, so another slide, unfortunately, with customers on it. But I think this is an important point. You know, when I go and talk to my clients in the EU, what are they asking for? And then what do we need in order to be able to deliver that for them? I think that's important. So kind of going from top to toe in this security and returns for retirement income, our heritage is institutional investment. So most of our clients are looking to invest their pension scheme assets, or they're looking to save for a long-term, you know, for their retirement or for a long-term savings goal. I think it's important to think about they need stable long-term returns, and for stable long-term returns, we're talking about you know, investor protection, we're talking about financial stability, we're talking about all of those things through a long-term life cycle. A lot of my clients have got kind of 5, 10, 15-year goals in mind, which is much longer than the average person on the street, and I think that's an important thing to remember. And really important to be able to do that is open markets. You know, I've mentioned best-in-class investment solutions, but it is really, really important. You think about the decade that we've had of really low-yielding, kind of, you know, low-growth environment. It's been really challenging for our clients to get a hold of yield and return and assets, and so being able to access markets across the globe has been a really important factor for them in terms of choosing their investment strategy. And so just again, when we're talking about cross-border, it's important to keep that in mind. That access is crucial to maintain that long-term return. And And part of that, I suppose, we're talking about the EU. For my clients, capital markets working smoothly is really, really important. You don't want any loss in liquidity. You want it working very smoothly. You want that financial stability. And that is important not just in the next kind of 6, 12, 24 months. It's important much more so over the longer term. And I think also to bring that all home again, investment markets are interconnected. They are global. Exactly the points that Nick's been raising. Our clients, our European clients, aren't just looking at investing in European assets. They're looking at investing much more widely. So I think these are the key things and the key themes that we're thinking about when we're putting strategies together for clients. And all of these items are hit by the regulatory topics that we're going to talk about today. So to take just a slightly different tack away from clients for a minute, talking about, I need to click through the slides. I keep forgetting this, sorry. Global trade requirements requires inclusive trade. So we are big believers in international trade. We remain optimistic on the future. So I think just to pull through some key topics that we thought were worth talking about today. Two very interesting charts that we've had a look at. So hopefully you'll be able to see them. They're big enough up there. But the one on the top left is the value of global exports, and this goes from the 1800s, I think, if you can see the bottom half. And you'll just see that things have massively ticked up since about the kind of mid-1900s or so, to the point that when you look at kind of 1947, I think is the stat we've got in here, it's just shy of $50 billion in terms of world trade. And then it rises catastrophically, or quite exponentially, up to nearly 13 trillion in 2005. It's out-of-date stats, but if you think about where it's gone, that trajectory is incredible. And taking a slightly longer history and focusing on England, because it's a country where you can get very long histories in these things. GDP per capita is quite an interesting stat here. Again, a very exponential chart. So, kind of bobs along, and there have definitely been bumps in the road, but actually where we've seen bumps in the road, generally, by and large, the long-term trends have been very positive. Things have got bigger, things have got better, and trade is a really important part of this. But these are quite fascinating charts, so certainly we find them fascinating. And tell me afterwards if you also think so. And bringing that all together, we do think trade and particularly growth need to work for everyone. So this is where I'm going to bring back my customers and my consumers again, because our core belief is in inclusive capitalism. Where it benefits the EU citizens, global citizens, that's the most important thing for us. And you'll see a list of things that we do down the right-hand side, which will mirror my earlier slide. But I think that's an important core belief that we hold. And we recognise, or certainly we believe, that there's always room for improvement, both in our business and generally, and room for reform. And I think, having the discussion today and getting different perspectives from the panel really adds to this debate about, how we can do things better for ultimately the citizens that we're trying to put these regulations in place for. So just to bring on the topic a little bit more and into the items that we've talked about here, or that are in your programme, and you'll forgive me, this is a wordy slide, but I thought some of these topics were interesting for you guys to read if you so chose. So, we definitely believe that a series of rules are very, very important. I don't think anybody's disputing that. I think the key thing here from a trade perspective is to make sure that it is inclusive and it does benefit those kind of global or EU citizens. And so it's more about what does it look like in practice, and how do we build that regulatory community, that trust, so that we can work together and that regulatory community can work together. That's quite an important point. I think when we're talking about trust, we talk about it being much easier when you come from the same starting point, when you have that sort of international standard, when you can look at that sort of side of things. And I think that's important, but it doesn't always mean you end up in the same place, I suppose. So how do you maintain that balance? How do you maintain that trade-off between control and adhering to the international standard setters? And we think that's quite important from an international trade perspective, but it really is about everybody following them. Or otherwise, you're kind of in the situation where if you don't adhere to the rules, then others won't. If you do, if you don't, and then others do, you're kind of in a slightly different situation. So coming down to the bottom of this slide, we're talking about the kind of flow down of kind of regulatory situations. So obviously it goes from a supranational down to regional, national, and consumers. I think back to the point that Nick was talking about earlier is we see the most important piece here is the rules result in outcomes, and they result in outcomes for the consumers. And that feedback loop coming back for us is the most important piece. Because if you can come to industry and you can come to the consumers themselves and have a discussion around how they're finding it and whether it's benefited them in the way that the first principles rules was trying to benefit them, I think that's the crucial piece for this. Taking a slight tack off trade and going back to what I know and love, which is investment management. And so the asset management, Nick has touched on it a little bit, it is definitively a global market. It's become increasingly global over the last decade. And customers are wanting access to those global markets. It's a really, really big part of the asset management industry. Those global markets, 10, 15 years ago, I was talking to clients about, I was in the UK at the time, so you forgive the UK example, but UK equities. I rarely have a conversation with a client about a domestic equity portfolio these days. So that's the really crucial part about markets being global. They are 24/7. They are interconnected. They go the whole way through the kind of time zones, and I think it's an important part. You mentioned your example about brokers. I think the key example from my perspective is that when I'm talking to clients about global portfolios, we have a centre in portfolio management centres in this kind of time zone. London, we've got Chicago, we've got Hong Kong. Our clients want to get access to those specialists in those regions. If you take a global credit portfolio, that will have an element of European bonds, UK bonds, and US bonds predominantly. My clients don't want a European portfolio manager trying to opine on the US market when we've got very, very strong people in the US who are sitting there, sleeping and breathing US credit all day long. So it's imperative that we're able to provide our clients with access to those specialists in the US for the long-term benefit of their portfolios. And I think that's a really key part of this. From an asset management perspective, it's recognising the necessity in that global operating model and making sure the regulations reflect that. I think that's a crucial part. And we've got some examples on the bottom, just in terms of some success stories. The one that I'm living at the moment, because we've got various UCITS funds at the moment, is UCITS. It's been a phenomenal success story for the EU. It's a phenomenal success story globally, because I mentioned earlier about the funds domiciled. It's registered in the EU, but actually it's not wholesale sold in the EU. We have clients from various parts of the globe who invest in that, and I think that's a really big success story from the last kind of 30 years or so. And being able to, the product itself has been a massive success. I think being able to manage the assets within that product is something that we need to be very mindful of. There's the top layer which faces off against the client, but it's only successful if you can offer that return process that we've talked about. Coming on to the lovely topic of equivalence. Now, we have an example here because we wanted to talk about equivalence. We definitely think it's a really great concept, and we believe that there is a lot of good in it. However, kind of talked a little bit. There is definitely things that we could do from re-looking at the equivalence regime, and potentially the next mandate might rightly focus on that. One would hope. But one thing that we thought might be quite useful is to give a very straightforward example or simple example of why we need to kind of just make sure there's consistency and continuity for those outcomes for our clients. So bear with me while I go through this quite pragmatic example. It is focused on the framework rather than legislation, so I won't be going into all the different details of the individual pieces. But so if you take on the left-hand side, we've got the euro. That is obviously absolutely aligned with everything in the EU. That goes without saying. So if you had a score for the equivalence rating of the EU, that would be 100%. If you're then looking at each of the other countries who might want to be deemed to be equivalent and provided them with an objective score, so went through all the different factors that you might need to consider in order to determine how equivalent or not they might be, one might end up with a variety of different scores. And so taking two examples here, we've got country X on the right-hand side, that's got a 90% score, and country Y at the left-hand side, it's got a 99% score. And then the question becomes, if both country X and country Y are deemed to be equivalent, and country W and country Z have scores of 93 and 98, then why in a simplistic world would they not be deemed to be equivalent also? And so it's just an interesting concept from an objective perspective about whether, when thinking about the regime, whether it is how you consider different countries and how they might be equivalent, trying to find sort of practical, pragmatic ways forward to reflect where certain countries could be deemed to be equivalent if you made some sort of adjustment like this. An interesting concept, one might suggest. I'll be interested in your thoughts later through the questions. A little bit more detail again, just coming back into the detail of equivalence, because you can't avoid the fact that equivalence is detailed, and the table on the right shows the areas where equivalence is included and not included, and where there's kind of differences in terms of the approaches. But I think the key point from this is, look, the interpretation. Equivalence was never meant to be equal. I think that's the important thing. You're never expecting a country to have exactly the same rule book, but how do we make sure that it's interpreted in the same way by everyone, so that we set the same standards, and that EU can make sure that on a case-by-case basis that they've got the right people in the club, if you will. I think that's an important piece, to make sure that the system is pragmatic, and it considers the practical aspects of the consumer, of the customer, when determining how you might look at the equivalence regime. And I think that's the important piece here on this slide. And then, to add more complexity into it, just to think about and reiterate the point, I suppose, we do think equivalence is a force for good. It is a great tool to have from an asset management perspective and from a consumer perspective. I think the table in this slide here shows the kind of complexity and the decision making around it, and obviously a huge amount of work goes into it, and we appreciate that. So you'll forgive my my simple example from earlier on. But the one thing it does show is, there's kind of 37 countries in here with 38 different issues. It's quite complex. There's various different Ys and blue bits in various different categories in different countries. It's just interesting to see that the kind of the difference in certain circumstances across different countries. But I think just talking about what might be useful from a reform perspective would be one key issue that we internally have debated quite a lot, is the ability to withdraw equivalence within 30 days. And I think from a practical perspective, thinking about it from the industry perspective, that doesn't really instill a great feeling of an enduring relationship for industry who's going to embark on an equivalence process or an equivalence regime. So, from an industry perspective, if I have a client and they're going to rely on us and let's say an equivalent regime that we may have or not have, I think that client might look at this and go, how can I meet my 5, 10, 15-year investment objective if that could be rescinded within 30 days? So just practically, it's worthwhile looking at that process, potentially longer-term horizon, and kind of making sure that is practically workable from an industry perspective. And finally, just thinking about granting equivalence, I think the key thing here is just back to my very simple example, is looking at how the principles of granting equivalence could be looked at to reflect the fact that, well, on an objective basis, certain countries will be further away and certain countries will be closer to the EU regime, and it's just making sure that process is looked at through any reform that might happen of equivalence. So thank you.